In the annals of political philosophy, two archetypes often stand in opposition: Machiavelli prince, who embraced the lion and the fox to secure power, and Plato philosopher king, who rules through wisdom and virtue. In a fictional world, one was called a villain, the other was called a hero. But in the real world, the line between hero and villain more often than not was blurred, so we invented a new character which we called anti-hero. If Niccolò Machiavelli had ever traveled to 15th century Korea, he would not have written The Prince for some mediocre Medici. He would have written it for Lee Bang-won. Lee Bang-won, or Taejong of Joseon, was the son of Yi Sung-gi, who later became Taejo of Joseon, the founder of Joseon dynasty. Taejong was famous for being the ruthless architect who stabilized the Joseon dynasty through iron-fisted consolidation of power. Taejong's reign was defined by what many would label as tyranny. He purged his brother in the first and second strife of prince and decimated his own in-laws, to prevent meddling of the consort clans. To casual observer, this is a raw Machiavellianism by securing the throne through well-used cruelty. Think of a country like a coral reef ecosystem. In the delicate architecture of coral reef, the absence of shark triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that eventually starved the reef at cellular level. Without the apex predators like sharks to keep them in check, mesopredators' population explode, overconsuming the herbivorous fish that are essential for the reef maintenance. This loss of grazers allow microalgae to grow unchecked, physically smothering the coral and blocking the sunlight required by zooxanthellae for photosynthesis. Deprived of their primary energy source and stressed by this shifting environment, the coral are forced to expel their microscopic partners in a process called bleaching, leaving the reef a fragile, colorless ghost of its former self, unable to support the very life that once flourished there. But he also transformed Joseon into a highly centralized and prosperous state, where the common people were generally fuller and more secure than in the previous generation. He dismantled private armies to prevent future coups like he did, and established six ministries, ensuring all administrative power flowed directly to the king. Notably, his reign even saw the introduction of the jomshim, or lunch, as a midday meal to refresh laborers. He modernized the state by introducing the Hoppe ID tax system for population control, creating the foundational 8-province system, and commissioning the mass production of metal movable type for printing. But he also executed cold-blooded strategic trade-off by transitioning from the Ilchon-Chukchon rule, where any slave parent meant a slave child, to the codified Nobi Jungmu Pop. While his bloody reputation suggests he could have freed everyone, he knew that total abolition would trigger economic collapse and a unified noble revolt. Instead, he chose to sacrifice children born from slave mothers to keep the aristocracy quiet, while herding the children of commoner mothers into the state tax and military registries. By codifying this matrilineal status in the formal law, he replaced the fake social custom with rigid bureaucratic system, intentionally trading individual human freedom for the institutional efficiency and centralized power of Joseon state, effectively sealing the fate of those who born to slave mothers within the system forever. But why do we call such a ruler a monster and call men who let their people starve the great? He was one of the most cultured men in Europe. Unlike most kings who just pretended to be smart, Frederick was the real deal. He wrote over 30 volumes of work, composed 121 flute sonatas, and spoke French better than German. He even renovated his Sanssouci palace to be a sanctuary for intellectuals. Prussia during Frederick the Great's reign was prosperous as a state, but this wealth was largely reinvested into military and government rather than being shared with the average citizen. He successfully transformed Prussia from a European backwater into an economically strong powerhouse. We are taught to admire philosopher king. We see Frederick the Great in his sun-drenched palace in Sanssouci, playing his flute and writing in French about the right of man. It is a beautiful image, But when you look past the gilded frames, you find a man who loved the idea of humanity more than humans themselves. He wrote the Anti-Machiavel, praising peace, while preparing to invade his neighbors. He wrote about the right of man while keeping his own people in serfdom, literally tied to the land like a property. Frederick was brilliant, but his brilliance was a solitary flame that consumed the oxygen around it. Frederick the Great was a genius. He was a military prodigy who survived a war against 3 empires at once, turning a small kingdom into a titan. But his genius was a poisonous gift. He built a clockwork state so complex that only he could win it. He didn't trust his minister, he didn't mentor his heir, and he treated his people like a cogs in a beautiful little machine. When the great man died, the machine broke, because he had loved the power of his own mind more than the stability of his people's future. During the 7 Years' War, Prussia lost roughly 10% of its total population. Most of these were just soldiers. They were civilians who died from famine, disease, and the scorched earth tactic used both by Frederick and his enemies. To fund his genius, Frederick essentially treated his civilians as renewable fuel. He enforced heavy taxes on cities and forced peasants into brutal conscriptions. If they ran away, he used hussar patrol to hunt them down like animals. He used them in human wave attacks, running them blindly into enemy fire to save his regular troops. When Frederick invaded Silesia or Saxony, he didn't intentionally massacre civilians for sports, but he did plunder their resources to feed his army, leaving thousands to starve in winter. What he wrote in French wasn't a pain to act against his integrity, but an excuse for his cruelty. He would write poetry about human rights in the morning and send thousands to die for a piece of Silesian coal in the afternoon. He didn't use power to achieve philosophy. He used philosophy to distract himself from the guilt of power. Socrates distinguished between wisdom lover from a victory lover. Frederick's life was dominated by thumos, spirited ambition for military glory and personal greatness, rather than a disinterested search for truth. He's not a philosopher, but more like a philodoxer. History has bias toward conquerors and intellectuals. Frederick invited most famous writer of his age, Voltaire, to his palace. He bought his reputation with poems and French conversation. Because he looked like the ideal European intellectuals, the West labeled him the Great. Even though his war for Silesia caused death of hundreds of thousands of commoners through famine and musket fire, the commoner who starved in Prussia didn't have pants. The nobles who lived at his court did. Anyone can talk about wisdom all day, but it takes true philosopher to look at a rotting country and have the courage to perform surgery needed to save it. Frederick is the Great for House of Hohenzollern, not for the people of Prussia. Yet this great genius intellectual of his time left his country with a system that could not survive without him, an incompetent ruler eager to erase his shadows, and a mountain of gold for him to squander. Frederick died in his chair, lonely and cynical, leaving a nephew who would bankrupt the country. And if there is a ruler who truly embodied philosophy in their blood, sweat, and tears, would be Marcus Aurelius. He is famously known for his journal meditation, which was never meant to be read by the public, and his tremendous stoic mind in the face of war. Meditation was a form of struggle, a battlefield of mind, where he was wrestling with himself. He wrote to keep himself from becoming a tyrant or succumbing to despair. It was his way of staying in the oven without burning. Marcus' reign was defined by an inescapable cocktail of crises, where he wasn't just fighting one problem, but he was trapped in a synergistic disaster, where each crisis made other impossible to solve. His stoicism led him to accept the world as it was. When the economy collapsed, he sold his furniture and debased the coin to survive the day. Marcus' economic decisions were not necessarily bad in intent, but they were a desperate response to a collapsing economy that he explicitly tried to protect from further tax burdens. His priority was to fund the empire's survival while shielding population already devastated by the Antonine Plague. His economic approach was cautious and focusing on prolonging existing system rather than making sweeping changes. He preferred selling his own imperial treasure to raise war fund rather than imposing extraordinary taxes on the elite. Marcus avoided aggressive taxes on the Roman elite to maintain political harmony within the Senate, choosing personal sacrifice over systemic wealth redistribution. Historians generally view this action not as mismanagement, but as the only available option for a leader who refused to strip his people while the state was essentially bankrupt. He managed cocktail of crisis with dignity, but didn't change the underlying crisis. In a world of power, virtue without ruthlessness often leaves a vacuum for those who have neither. Marcus was a saintly man, but the Roman Empire at that moment probably needed a reformer more than a philosopher. Marcus' kindness led to a dead end for Rome. The core paradox of philosopher king, their greatest strength, their uncompromising virtue, is also their terminal weakness in the face of human nature. Because of their belief, they struggle to use the necessary cruelty required to prune their own garden. They treat political cancer with philosopher bandage instead of a builder's scalpel. History suggests that legacy of pure wisdom cannot survive without the pragmatic foundation of power. Taejong provided the soil and he cleared the weeds so Sejong flower of culture and science could bloom without being trampled. But Marcus has no such builder before or after him. He was a lone pillar trying to hold up a collapsing roof. Without a Taejong to break the Senate, or Seijo to enforce order after him, his stoic work was immediately washed away by the tide of Commodus' greed. A pure philosopher king rules for the ideal state, but they must rule over real people. Wisdom can guide a nation, but only a raw power can protect that wisdom from the inevitable entropy of human ambition. Without a monster like Taejong to set the stage, the philosopher king is just a saint waiting for his lifework to be dismantled. Marcus saved his soul but lost his future. Frederick saved his state but lost his people. And Taejong? Taejong sacrificed his reputation to save both. Taejong transformed Joseon into a highly centralized and prosperous state, where the common people were generally fuller and more secure than in previous generations. By abolishing private armies and conducting a rigorous land census that doubled national revenue, he created wealth necessary to build a state grain reserve and ensure a more equitable tax system. His social reform further improved livelihood by freeing hundreds of thousands of slaves, allowing them to work on their own profit. Notably, his reign even saw the introduction of the jomsim as a midday meal to refresh laborers. As a military hardliner, he protected his prosperity by attacking and vassalizing Georgian tribes on the northern border and subjugating Japanese pirates in the south, eventually initiating the 1419 Oi invasion of Tsushima Island during his retirement to eliminate the pirate bases. Despite wielding absolute power, he displayed a rare lack of territorial greed compared to a typical tyrant. Rather than seeking reckless expansion, he utilized his authority to prioritize internal stability and national security, choosing to build a secure foundation for his people rather than overextended empire. While the Hoppe identification system increased the state control, it stabilized agricultural output, which combined with the Simon Guthrum for direct royal appeal, provided a level of stability and sustenance that served as a bedrock for the golden age of his son, Sejong the Great. From the moment he helped his father overthrow Goryeo, his identity was the architect of Joseon. He saw the chaos of the old dynasty and decided that order was the only morality mattered. Unlike many of his predecessors or successors, who were primarily military general or career royals, Taejong was exceptionally well educated in Confucian classics. He was the only son of the dynasty founder Yi Song-gye. To pass the difficult civil service examination during the Goryeo dynasty in 1382. While not a philosopher in the sense of creating new theories, he was a staunch proponent of Neo-Confucianism. He used it as a political philosophy to restructure society, diminish the power of Buddhist temples, and justify centralized king-centered government. Taejong was a functional architect who ensured dynasty survival. He provided an administrative and legal foundation that allowed Joseon to endure for 5 centuries. He performed dirty work his father avoided, and once in power, he transformed a fragile military regime into centralized monarchy. By ruthlessly dismantling the old Goryeo power structure and centralizing all authority under the ground, Taejong shifted Joseon from a mere change in the leadership into fundamentally new stable and functional state. However, Taejong's genius lay in the motive. Unlike a typical despot, his violence was surgical, aimed at a singular philosophical goal, the total centralization of the state. The definitive proof of Taejong's philosophical depth was his voluntary abdication. Most of Machiavellian princes cling to the power until the grave. Taejong, however, recognized that his function was complete. In a move of supreme political astuteness, he bypassed birthright to appoint his third son, Sejong the Great, as his successor. Taejong remained in the shadow as a retired king, retaining military control only to finish the dirty work of purges, effectively shielding Sejong's reputation. He took blood into his own hand so that Sejong could rule with ink, leading to the creation of Hangul and scientific pilgrimage. When he purged his brother or his in-law, he didn't write poetry about his guilt. He viewed those deaths as necessary surgical removal to prevent the cancer of civil war. He was a man of action, who fully embraced the lion persona to ensure philosopher king could follow. He wasn't a tyrant who happened to be smart. He was a philosopher using Machiavellian tools to solve a specific existential equation for his country. A typical Machiavellian prince seeks power for glory or survival. Taejong's motives, however, were deeply rooted in Neo-Confucian political philosophy. He wanted to create Minbon society, but he was philosopher enough to realize that benevolence without order is just chaos. He understood that a philosopher king cannot rule if the foundations are rotting. By purging the corrupt private armies and the meddling in-laws, he was clearing the land to plant the seed of a philosophical state. He did the evil acts because he had the philosophical vision of 500-year peace. Frederick was like Renaissance artist. He was obsessed with form, efficiency, and legacy. He made Prussia even he had to use excuses and Machiavellian tactics to do it. Frederick is the maker of the states. He looked outward and reshaped the map to fit its mind. Marcus Aurelius is the baker. He didn't make a new Rome. He tried to save the soul of the old one while it was cracking under the pressure of the plague and invasion. As the baker, he accepted the cracks, the suffering, the loss, the betrayal as a natural. He argued that the heat of the struggle is what makes the bread of human character worth consuming. Marcus is the maker of man. He looked inward and reshaped his mind to fit the world. Taejong was the butcher who understood the greater good even if it required dirty hands. He was the apex predator who built the system that actually protected the weak from the strong. He accepted the reputation of the butcher because he knew someone had to clean the house for the next generation. By stepping down early, he proved he cared more about Joseon's future than his own power. Taejong because legacy was system so strong it survived foolish ruler who came later. He strengthened the office of the Censor General and veritable record. This system meant that even a bad king was constantly criticized and recorded by scholars. He turned six ministries into a professional engine that kept the country running even when the king was lazy or incompetent. But it also meant he built the strongest prison for those he chose to sacrifice, driving the record of the longest unbroken chain of slavery in human history. Real wisdom is not about being nice, it's about being effective for the people who cannot defend themselves. Real leadership isn't about being a good man in your diary. It's about having a steel to ensure the world remains good after you're gone. As a fellow commoner, whether you are going to follow the great man who writes poems while your house burns, or to follow the tyrant who fixes the pipe so your kids don't starve but also sacrifice your relative, is your choice. Anyway, there's nothing perfect.